Okay, so this story is by Beryl Ashenberg, and it's about a man named Grandpa Allen. Grandpa Allen was a member of the Unitarian Church of Nottingham, and he was a beloved member. Everyone loved Grandpa Allen. They loved him because he did a lot of things at the church. He was friendly to everyone. He was kind to everyone. And they loved him for one more really important reason. Grandpa Allen was a fantastic baker. He baked delicious things. Everyone knew that if you came to a church event and Grandpa Allen had baked something, there was going to be something really, really, really good to eat. So, when it was time for the church to have their annual bread communion service, the church staff knew that the person to ask to volunteer was Grandpa Allen. So they called up Grandpa Allen and they said, Grandpa Allen, will you bake the bread for the church communion service? And Grandpa Allen said, of course, I will bake some bread. And he said, you know what, in fact, I am happy to bake all the bread. You don't need to ask any other volunteers. I'm happy to take care of all the bread needs for the church communion service. And everyone was thrilled. He took care of it all. That was great. Because they knew that whatever Grandpa Allen baked, it would be baked with love. He always said his secret ingredient was love. It was great. So the morning before Thanksgiving, the morning of the church bread communion service, they arrived at church, the people arrived, and Grandpa Allen was already there. He had made the dough at home, and he had come to church, and he was baking the bread in the church kitchen. So when the people arrived, the church smelled like baking bread. That delicious, yeasty smell, the wonderful smell of baking bread. As the people walked into the building, they could smell it. Their mouths were watering as they walked into church and sat down. The whole church smelled delicious. And they sat down in their seats and they sang the opening hymns and they were just waiting. And the minister stood up and he talked about all the things we talk about at Bread and Cider Communion. He talked about the earth and the gift of wheat and the gifts that we get from the harvest. And the people sat there just waiting to taste this delicious bread that they could smell. And then it was finally time. And there the back doors opened and the minister signaled and in walked Grandpa Allen carrying this gorgeous golden brown loaf of bread. And he brought it forth to the front of the congregation. And a little boy sitting right out front said something that a few other members of the congregation were wondering, but they weren't going to say out loud. He said, but Grandpa Allen, how is that one loaf of bread going to feed all of these people? Because there were over 100 people there, and it was just one loaf of bread. And the other people started to kind of titter, and there were whispers. But Grandpa Allen, he didn't say anything. He just put his one loaf of bread down on the table, and he took out a knife, and he cut the bread in half. And the bread went sproing, and it multiplied into 2 whole loaves of bread. And then he cut the bread again, and it went sproing, and it multiplied into 2 more loaves of bread. And he cut it again, and it went sproing, and it multiplied into 2 more loaves of bread. And pretty soon, there were 10 loaves of bread, and there was plenty of bread to feed everyone in the congregation. And someone yelled out, "It's a miracle!" And Grandpa Allen said, "Don't be ridiculous. It's a perfectly simple mathematical principle." But they decided not to argue about it because everyone was hungry, and they were ready to have bread and finish their communion. So at coffee hour, everyone came up to Grandpa Allen and they thanked him for the delicious bread and they asked him about his recipe, and he said, of course, that it was made with love and it was a mathematical principle and that he was very happy that everyone enjoyed it. And then someone came up to Grandpa Allen. It was Barbara. And he knew that if Barbara was coming up to him, she was going to ask him for a favor because Barbara was the director of religious education. So Barbara came up to Reverend Allen and she said, Grandpa Allen. And she came up to Grandpa Allen and she said, Grandpa Allen, the youth group has been going to the food bank every Saturday. And every Saturday we run out of food because there are so many hungry people in our area. would you come to the food bank with us? Would your bread trick work at the food bank? And Grandpa Allen said, well, it's not really a trick, it's a mathematical principle. But she said, would it work? Yes, of course. So the next Saturday, Grandpa Allen brought a loaf of bread to the food bank. And sure enough, when he cut it in half, sprung, it multiplied. And now there were 2 loaves. And then again and again. And there was plenty of food to feed everyone at the food bank. Now, something special like this cannot stay secret for long. And sure enough, that night on the 6 o'clock news, there was a story about Grandpa Allen and his magical bread. And now we are going to meet the villain in our story. The villain was the sheriff of Nottingham, who you may know as a villain from a different story. So the sheriff of Nottingham, he was a very, very, very mean man. And I'm going to tell you how mean he was. You want to hear how mean he was? He was so mean. Here's how mean he was. He would tease puppies. He would take candy from children. He would say swear words in front of old people. That is how mean he was. He hated everybody. And he was always trying to do something to get rich quick. And when he saw Grandpa Allen's bread, he thought this was the greatest thing ever. If he could get his hands on that bread, he could make tons of loaves of bread, and he could sell that bread, and he would get lots and lots of money. So he decided to pay a visit to Grandpa Allen, and that's what he did. And so he asked nicely, and Grandpa Allen would not give him the bread. And Grandpa Allen said, you don't understand, it wouldn't even work for you. It's nothing personal, but it's just not going to work for you. But the sheriff didn't understand that. So then the sheriff tried to buy the bread from Grandpa Allen. And Grandpa Allen said, I can't sell it to you. It's not going to work. And so then the sheriff tried to force Grandpa Allen to give him the bread. And eventually the sheriff just shoved Grandpa Allen out of the way, ran into the kitchen, stole the bread, and took it home with him. I told you he was not a nice guy. He took the bread home, he put it on his table, the sheriff cut the bread in half, and sproing. Do you know what happened? The bread divided, and divided, and divided into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, until eventually it was just crumbs, and then it was just tiny, tiny particles, and then it was just absolutely nothing. And Grandpa Allen said, I told you, it's a mathematical principle. Love multiplies, hatred divides. Thank you for listening to my story today.